Well, hi, my name is Karlyn Viña, and I'm the percussion professor here at Shenandoah Conservatory in Winchester, Virginia. I've made this video to share with folks who will be preparing for our upcoming All Virginia auditions next month. I really hope this is helpful. Remember, you can always reach out to me via email if you have any questions or comments. I would be happy to hear from you. My email address is kvina@su.edu, and you can find that below in the description. So before we get into the details of each excerpt, I'm going to be referring to some measure numbers in this video. So it's a good idea to hit pause now and write in some measure numbers if you haven't already done that. So without further ado, let's get into the music. First up is Snare Drum with an excerpt from Etude number 14 from Portraits in Rhythm by Anthony Cirone. And the main technical elements that you'll find in this excerpt are flams and drags. So you'll want to make sure that you have a really nice setup for both of these with one stick high and one stick low. I tend to favor the right hand for main notes and flams and drags, and I was able to do that just fine in this excerpt. But if you have a different sticking preference, that should also work. What I wouldn't recommend doing is alternating the repeated drags that you see in measures 62 through 65, because that just makes it more difficult to get a consistent sound, and it could even cause problems with the timing in those measures. It is customary in a concert snare drum etude like this to play the grace notes and the drags more like a short buzz rather than like two clear notes before the main note as you would in a rudimental context. I like to vocalize the sound we're going for here like this. Ja, ja. Since this excerpt is written entirely in 3/8 with a dotted quarter note pulse, it's really important to make sure that we're showing the meter with some natural metric inflection. In this case, that means placing a bit more weight on beat 1 with a lighter beat 2 and a sense of lift on 3 like this. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It is always important to pay attention to details in audition preparation. And in this case, we want to make sure we're showing the difference between accented and unaccented notes. Be careful of this when you're first learning the excerpt because we build muscle memory every single time we practice, which is a good thing, but it means it could be more difficult to add those kinds of details in later on. In the repeated rhythmic figures in measures 65 through 67, if you are using a right, left, right sticking like I did, it's important to make sure that the left hand doesn't stay at grace note height for the and of 2 for that regular note. If your left hand is a little lazy and it stays low, it can sound a little bit more like ja-da-da instead of ja-da-da, which is what we want. We want that left hand note to be equal with the right hand notes right in line there. If you're having some trouble with the control in the left hand, moving between the grace notes of the drag and the regular note on the and of 2, just make sure to practice this figure slowly so you can train that pattern. Timing can be a bit tricky in this excerpt, especially in the measures without downbeats. So I recommend using the metronome first with the subdivision on all 3 beats. Make sure you're playing the rhythms correctly. Then you're going to take away subdivision and only have downbeats. And then you're going to take away every other downbeat. So you only have every other downbeat as you're playing. And what this does is it will test your sense of pulse and find where you may be rushing or dragging. If you're really solid with every other downbeat, you can even spread out the click even more if you're able to. It's just a really great tool for correcting our tendencies rather than relying on the metronome to give us every beat. I want you to make sure to practice playing downstrokes to your beating spots for soft playing to make the subito piano at the start of measure 72 as effective as possible. Slow practice is the best way to make sure that your stroke and your beating spots here are just how you want them to be. Finally, the last note is marked fortissimo. I like to play this flam with a really big free stroke to allow for maximum resonance. Resist the temptation to play this with a lot of downward force into the drum here, because that can actually make it sound and feel a little bit more restrictive and not big and open and fortissimo. We want it to be very strong. So next up is the xylophone excerpt. The first thing you may want to do as you're learning these notes is to plan out your stickings. Most of the stickings in this excerpt flow pretty well, but I did decide to put a double in the second measure of the excerpt and then another one in the final measure of the excerpt. I like the double left on the first two notes of measure 36, that's the second measure, to allow the A on beat 2 of 36 to be played with the right hand, but it's not the only good option. You could put a double somewhere else if you like that better. In the final measure, I put a double right on the G and A so that the left hand can play that C sharp. If you find you prefer another sticking option, just make sure that it'll work at your tempo goal before you spend weeks and weeks practicing with a sticking that might not work at the tempo you need it to. Since this excerpt doesn't have any dynamics or articulations or really musicality written in, I think it's a good idea to add some. Now, I wouldn't do anything really dramatic that's not written, like a crescendo from piano to fortissimo. But I do want you to always be thinking about direction and phrasing and flow. One opportunity for adding something like articulation here would be in measures 40 and 46, which are the measures that only have eighth notes. I like to give these notes a little bit more of an emphasis in weight to show the difference in length between the eighth notes and all of the 16 notes that come before and after those measures. Be careful with timing in the second to last line with all of those ties into beat 2. I definitely recommend using your metronome here. Your tendency is probably going to be to play the E of 2 a little earlier than it should be played. Finally, I think you'll want to plan the number of strokes in the roll in measure 44. I found it comfortable to play a quintuplet there, starting on the left hand and releasing on beat 2 with the right hand. But I think depending on your sticking, a sextuplet could also work well. Finally, on to the timpani excerpt. So you may have noticed that this excerpt is based off of the timpani part from a major orchestral work. If you are not already familiar with Symphonic Metamorphosis by Paul Hindemith, or even if you are familiar with it, you should definitely go and listen to it. Understanding the source material will inform the style and character of this excerpt. I do think the stickings that Vic Firth includes here are good and work well for this passage. I think you should follow those. Be careful with timing in this excerpt, especially through the syncopated measures. You can use a similar metronome strategy to the one I mentioned earlier. Practice with the metronome on half notes, then only on downbeats, then maybe every other downbeat, just to find your tendencies, find out where you want to push ahead a little bit or pull back. Pay special attention to your beating spots throughout this excerpt, of course, but especially in the second to last measure when your right hand has to play on the 32. It's easy to have a little bit of a wild beating spot there if you're not careful. And then for the final measure, practice the shifting there slowly to make sure you can do it in a really relaxed and efficient way. Make sure to dig into the accents that you see in measures 29, 30, and 31 to help bring out the character of the passage. And finally, make sure you're always thinking about direction and phrasing throughout this excerpt. When you listen to Symphonic Metamorphosis, that will help guide your decision-making on the phrasing here for sure. Now that we've gotten through the excerpts, make sure that you read the percussion instructions and check the diagram really carefully. You'll want to make sure to practice with the setup exactly like it's shown in the diagram so you can master the choreography of performing and moving between the instruments. You really don't want any surprises on audition day. And even though there are always a lot of notes to learn, don't skip on practicing your rudiments. Don't skimp on your scales, and especially on sight reading. Sometimes we don't love to practice sight reading, but it's really important. These are really important elements of the audition. Thanks so much for checking out the video. I would love to hear from you in the comments or via email if you found this helpful or if you have any questions as you're working through this. Happy practicing.